The views and opinions on Where Did the Road Go belong to those making them. Do not mistake allowing freedom of speech for agreement. This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by the following amazing individuals: Greg Ross, Billuminati, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, and Michael Frisky. Thank you all for helping to make this show possible. And if you'd like to help out, become a patron at wheredidtheroadgo.com. It's only $3 a month for lots of extra content.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight I welcome back a stranger who has not been here in a few years, Mr. Jim Harrell.
Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Busier than ever. Still paranormal podcasting with the various shows, and still my probably most popular one is Jim Harrell's Campfire. Still kind of curating those spooky stories and doing 90 minutes of it every week. And people still have the stories. They keep calling in, Seriah, and always fascinating to hear what they have to say.
Yes, and you haven't done one of these in a while. And so when I was contacted about, you had a press department work, a promotion group working.
Yeah, I had some folks doing some publicity for this latest book, True Ghost Stories, Volume 6 from Jim Harrell's Campfire. And the previous 5 were done pretty quickly. And then because things got so busy with podcasting and life, you know, we had to move and kids graduating from high school and going to college and then a college graduation. Everything was going so busy that I kind of put the books on hold. And I said, you know what? I think it's been 8 years since I did a book or something. I need to get another book out. And I was sharing with you these stories. I mean, you know, it's 2024 and we've been doing this podcast since 2009. This was our second podcast, but first one started in 2005, the Paranormal Podcast, which is also still going. But, you know, we had a lot of stories and said, if I'm ever going to catch up to where we are now, I better get started with some more books. So Volume 6, and like the other books, it's just a compilation. This is 65 spooky stories, and it's a big mix. There's some, we were talking about high strangeness. There's some of those stories, traditional ghost stories, time slips, just kind of a cornucopia of spookiness.
And when they contacted me, I'm thinking, man, how many books has Jim been on since I had him on last? Oh, none. Okay.
Yeah, I kind of kicked back on the writing thing, but it's back, and I plan on doing one in 2025 as well, book 7.
Cool. These are always fun to read. You know, there's always those one or two where I go, I don't know about this one. This one feels like it might not be true, but you know, you can't really tell. And I'd rather believe someone who's lying than not believe someone who's telling the truth.
Yeah, you know, I think, you know, I would never say that every person who has ever appeared on the Campfire has given a real account, but it is my sense that people making stuff up is a lot less common than I actually expected when I started it. I think the vast, vast majority, I mean, over 90, high 90s, are being absolutely honest and explaining what happened to them as they experienced it. Now, whether it's a ghost or it's something else, I don't know. But, you know, I was really worried about that when I started this. I'm like, oh, people are going to be calling in, just making stuff up. And I don't believe that's the case. Now, of course, I'm sure over 15 years, you know, I just posted literally tonight my 683rd episode of Campfire. I'm sure somewhere in there somebody made something up.
Sure.
But that is the vast majority, I think, is not the case. People are being honest and sincere about what they perceive they experience.
And I totally agree with you. There's every once in a while there's a red flag, and I'll be like, I don't know, that seems a little weird, but okay, you know, like it doesn't mean they're lying.
See, I think something even Campfire has, and I've always been a believer, you know, hopefully not to the extent that my brains fall out, but having an open mind, but not so open your brains fall out. But I've always been a believer in these things. But if anything, Campfire, doing that for the last 15 years, has even pushed that further for me. I even believe it more because I don't believe all these people are making this stuff up.
No.
There's a great quote, and I know it's been around for probably like 100 years or something, but I recently ran into it and I love it, and I'll butcher it. But the general gist is, not only is the universe stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine.
Yes. Yeah.
And I believe that's true.
And with this stuff, I mean, you see all of this stuff across culture going all the way back in time.
Yes.
So there's something happening. It may not be what we think it is, but there's definitely a phenomena.
That's right. That's exactly right. I mean, it's kind of like when people talk about the flood myth, right?
Yeah.
Well, the flood myth like goes across religions, it goes across cultures, across civilizations. And, you know, if everybody's talking about the Great Flood, in however they describe that, chances are there was a pretty big flood one time.
And we have evidence of that at the end of the last ice age.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Where the waters rose 400 feet.
So similarly, in fact, I do a show with my wife that we've done on and off for the last, I've done the show on and off for the last 15 years. I'll do it for a couple of years and I'll stop and then I'll pick it up 6 years later. So then we just picked it back up, the Paranormal Report, and now I'm doing the show with my wife. I had folks other hosts I dealt with in the past, and just ran across a story about the Chinese, and they had discovered these bones and they thought that they were dragon bones, but they were later, and this was in something like Scientific American or livescience.com. So it wasn't the Weekly World News. And they later found out that these bones were used as a kind of a fortune-telling device, that they would write a question on the bones and they would cast the bone, and the way it cracked or something, they would interpret the cracks or something. And then they would pick up the bone, which, you know, was still in one piece, even if it had cracks in it, and they would write another question until there was no more room for any questions. So it was reusable. But the thing is that why is that kind of metaphysical thing, a paranormal thing in a way, why is that kind of inbred in us? Where does that come from? Why do people in ancient China have that same fascination that we have today? To me, that means there's something to it.
Yeah.
Don't know what that is, but you know, this kind of thing has gone on pretty much forever. And to me, that speaks to the fact that it speaks to an aspect of reality that we don't understand, but it's no less real.
Yes, that's a very good way of putting it. Let's get to some of your stories here.
I've got the book in front of me, and I'm willing and ready to read as best I can.
So let's start with one that's also one of the ones I really like that you also really like, and that is The Devil is Real.
Yes. Well, what do they say? The biggest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing everyone he didn't exist. Well, this is a short one. This is from Seriah in Pennsylvania, and I'll just read it. Seriah said, "I've used Ouija boards since I was a child. Many people frown on that, but it's always interested me. I started with my friend Molly years ago, and we would play it every single night over the summer. Whether at my house or hers, we would always be on this thing. The same spirit, Gail, would come through each time. Every night we'd ask for someone different, but it would always be Gail. And at the time it seemed innocent. Nothing was weird aside from the fact that we were talking to the dead." Now, we had heard that you're not supposed to leave the Ouija board on the floor because it was considered disrespectful to the spirits. So during this particular session in question, we had the board propped up on a broken, unplugged, that's very important, guitar amp, and we were talking with Gail the spirit. Not much was happening, but then the planchette stopped moving, and the room got very still and spooky. The unplugged amp clicked on and started making sounds like an old radio tuner. I'm envisioning something like...
Yeah.
And when someone tries to dial in a station. We were taken aback by the noise coming out of this broken amp, and it was unplugged. Then it got worse. Suddenly, we heard this deep southern voice of a man who sounded like a preacher, and he said, "The devil is real." Then the amp audibly clicked off. I never ran so quickly in my entire life. We couldn't recall much about what happened next. Molly and I were almost killing each other to get out of that room. Now, some might question my judgment, but I went right back to the Ouija board, and nothing like that has happened since. I don't know what was coming through that night, but it was terrifying. That's Mariah from Pennsylvania.
The interesting thing is just recently, well, within the last year, Jeremy Vaeni put up the Paratopia where he talks about when, as a kid, they used the Ouija board. And one of the things that happened is the radio started playing while it was unplugged.
And what's cool about this story is probably from 2014. So that shows that there's a commonality there, right? That this has happened to multiple people. And we've had other stories, not necessarily with the Ouija board, but with appliances or televisions turning on when they're unplugged. We had one from a funeral home years ago, very early on the show. I think it might be in one of the earlier books, where a woman worked there and all this weird stuff. And one thing would be a light would switch on and people think, oh, that's kind of weird, it switched on. But what they didn't realize, it was unplugged at the time.
Right.
So that's particularly freaky to me, because how do you explain that? I could explain something if it's plugged in, there's an electrical glitch, something like that, turning on. But if something's physically unplugged, how do you explain that other than something like the paranormal?
Yeah. I remember back, like when you still had mostly tape players in cars and stuff. My friend's car this was like early 90s, just had a radio. And we were driving along the lake where there was like no reception. So he turned it on just to see if we could get anything in. There was nothing. It's running static. And then all of a sudden the static stops. A commercial for a band we like playing in Rochester comes on. The entire commercial plays from start to finish, and then it goes back to static.
Ooh.
And we were just like, did that really just happen? Like,
yeah,
just that commercial, and then it was gone.
Well, I had a weird thing that happened electronically, and I think I know the explanation for it, but I grew up in a very kind of gritty area, an industrial area. So there were, literally, I didn't live on the wrong side of the tracks. I almost lived on the tracks, because you look out the window and maybe 75 yards away, there were railroad tracks out of the side window. Out of the front window, you would look and there was a smokestack with fire coming out of it, a blast oxygen furnace. My dad worked in the steel mill. And for whatever reason, when all my dad's friends decided to move to the suburbs, he said, I'm staying here. So anyway, I grew up in this really gritty area. So there was a lot of tractor trailers driving around and stuff. So I think and one time, I'll tell you, this was probably the mid 80s, I was converting some old 8-tracks to cassette because 8-tracks were definitely on their way out, and there was it was some old stuff my parents had, and I had like these cheap jacks that went from the stereo to the 8-track player. It was not very elegant, not like what we have now.
Right.
But I recorded it, and then I listened back, and there were people talking on it.
Oh.
And one person was saying, listen to that little birdie sing. It was a singer. And it was, I wish I still had that tape. Now, part of me says, okay, they were cheap cables. Somehow this was, leaking essentially, and people were picking it up on their CBs, because CBs were still a thing back then.
Right.
And somehow the interference happened. But now, the more I think about it, maybe not. And I mean, it was not subtle. It was not like an EVP. It was like, listen to that little birdie sing. And I wish to God I still had that tape, because I never thought about anything paranormal. But now, with the experience I've had, I'm like, was it a technical thing, or was it? And it's just as clear as I was talking to you right now. Right. Listen to that little birdie sing. And now I'll always question whether that was some kind of weird electronic glitch and interference, or because obviously they were hearing the singing, right? So it wasn't like it was just bleed over from a CB interfering or something across the cheap cables. But they were hearing the singer. So how would that work?
There was someone I just had on who they had if I'm remembering right, it was someone I just had on. They had recorded themselves like messing around on a cassette recorder. And when they played it back, it was a brand new tape, and there was a chorus singing on it.
Yikes. Ooh.
So it's kind of like, oh, that's odd.
Yeah. I don't know. Again, weird things happen. I call them head scratchers. They're some of my favorites.
So let's go on to the creepy crawly thing.
Yeah, this was Ed from Texas. And he tells the story. Actually, he lived in California at the time when this incident happened. He said, in 2004, I worked at a paper mill in Pomona, California. One Thursday night, I was assigned to the basement driving a forklift. Now, a basement sounds spooky, Ed says, but it's on ground level and usually not that bad. At this mill, we recycled newsprint. Sometimes there were staples and other things in the paper that would have to be removed while preparing it for recycling. All these items are taken out and then fall into a large container in the basement. My job was to take the container, drain out any water by rotating it, then drive it outside and put it in the trash. To my left was a long, dark hallway. To my right was an electrical room and some water clarifiers. In between was a long, dark hallway about 40 to 50 feet long. I picked up the container and started rotating it. I was looking at the edge of the container because I didn't want any solid material to fly out, just the water. As I was looking to the side, I saw something off in the distance about 30 feet away, and it looked like a person, and it was crawling on the floor. Within seconds, it went from 30 feet away to 3 feet in front of me. It moved extremely fast. I watched as it came up to me, and then it just disappeared. I looked around and there was nothing to be seen. I thought maybe it was somebody and they crawled underneath. But the forklift was too low for anybody to fit under it. I didn't even bother to empty that container. I just put the thing back down and left pronto. There were 2 hours left on my shift, and when I think of it now, I laughed, but it scared the life out of me. I got into my chemical hazard shack, closed it, and waited out the 2 hours. Thinking about it, I remember that the crawler looked like a man. He wore a short-sleeved blue shirt, which looked like part of a work uniform. He was Caucasian with blondish hair. The strange thing was that I couldn't remember his face. I don't know if it was just blurry or if he had skin pulled over his face. He didn't crawl like an average person, though. He seemed almost lizard-like, and he knew how to crawl exceptionally well. A few days later, I worked with another guy on the crew who ranked above me, and he was a clarifier operator. He was instructing me how to do his job. So I was in his shack, and my coworker was training me. Out of the blue, he said, "Hey, Ed, I forgot to tell you. I saw something strange last Thursday." We were both working that night. My shift ended at 11 p.m., but my coworker worked late until 3 a.m., and he said that around midnight, something strange happened. He was going to check on some clarifiers, and while walking, he saw somebody crawling right in front of him. The guys at the mill like to play practical jokes to scare each other, so he thought maybe somebody was messing around. The guy he saw crawling went behind a big water tank, so he ran to the other side to catch him, thinking it was a joke. But nobody was there, and he said there was no way anyone could have gotten past him. The figure just disappeared into thin air. This thing crawled sideways, and he said it looked like it was bent over backwards, crawling with his back facing the ground. Now, think about that.
Yeah.
What person can crawl quickly with their back facing the ground if they can do it at all? Anyway, Ed said I hadn't told anybody about what I'd seen and put it back in my mind. I didn't want to think about it. I had a wife and a young child, and the job paid well. I was trying to forget the whole thing. I apparently turned very pale when my coworker told his story, and I decided to tell him mine. For the next couple of weeks, we tried to ask guys who worked there for a long time about any fatalities at the mill. We thought maybe the crawler was a ghost or something. There were 2 fatalities at the mill in the 1970s. One didn't fit the description, and it was gruesome, so I won't go into detail. The second one, though, did fit. Back then, they used to have summer internships for college students. A worker there was carrying a large 1,000-pound filing cabinet on a forklift. He was guiding this college student, and the forklift was coming forward. The intern tripped and fell backward. The person on the forklift hit the brakes, and the filing cabinet tipped over onto the student. The guy said that the kid was getting up when the cabinet crushed him, essentially folding him in half. That might be the figure we saw. If so, it's very sad. Whatever it was, for the rest of my life, I will never forget that creepy crawling thing coming towards me. And that's Ed from Texas. So, I mean, again, what's the logical explanation? What kind of person can crawl that fast and sideways and with its back facing the floor?
Well, I can say this. There are at least 2 female wrestlers in Japan who can do that.
Whoa.
It's kind of freaky when they do it because they'll like duck a clothesline, so they're arched backwards, and then they'll crawl, toward their opponent in that position, like lightning fast.
I would be out of the ring immediately. No mas.
That's actually what that reminded me of when they described it. I'm like, oh, it reminds me of the thing Tam does.
Wow. I mean, yeah, people are capable of amazing things, but that would be an odd skill for just somebody in an odd plant to have in California.
Exactly. Yeah, that does not seem like it was probably a real person.
Yeah, whatever it was, I wouldn't want to run into it. And the thing is that, it's one of those things, when you're by yourself and things, you start to wonder, ooh, is there something coming at, some of these stories really, really get you to thinking.
Let's go to another one that I know you liked a lot, which is the mysterious Mrs. Raspberry.
Oh, I love this one. This might be my favorite one in the book. And this was, let me see the storyteller's name. I want to give credit here. Jennifer from Idaho. It was the early 1980s, and we lived in a smallish town in Idaho, she says. In the summertime, you get up in the morning, say goodbye to your mom, and be gone until dinner time. And remember those days before no cell phones, folks.
Yeah.
Well, one day my friend Connie and I decided to walk down the decommissioned railroad tracks about a block from my house. They ran all the way down to the lake about 4 miles away. We packed a lunch and started walking all the way down the tracks. We were about 8 or 9 years old and ready for some adventure. It was densely forested once we got about a mile from our house. We were walking and there was a big clearing. A couple of houses were there, and there was also a big raspberry thicket by one of them. A lady was hanging her laundry up on the line. We stopped to talk to her. She was lovely and sweet, and she asked us if we'd like some raspberries. So we took our shirts and made little baskets. You know how you hold them out and put things in them to hold when you're a kid? Well, we put the berries in our shirts and kept on toward the lake. We made it, stayed most of the day. Finally, we decided to head back home and started walking back in the same direction. We completely retraced our steps from earlier in the day. And from what I understand, it was a straight line, one way in, one way out. So Jennifer goes on to say, we walked all the way to my house and never passed that house again. There was no house. There was no clearing. There was nothing, just railroad tracks. They only go one way. It's not like we took a wrong turn. And we knew we'd met the kind lady with the raspberries because it wasn't our imagination. We had raspberry stains all over our shirts to prove it. The woman was a substantial older lady, and women of a certain age often wore a snap-up house dress back in the day. She was wearing one of those. It might be odd to us now, but it was commonplace back then. She was a substantial, kind lady. There wasn't anything strange about the interaction. She was friendly, the way people are to little kids. I had an opportunity about a year ago to talk to my friend Connie, who was with me that day. And she remembers everything exactly as I do, and we're still both scratching our heads. Now, not too long after this actually happened, I talked to my grandma, who believed in all things strange and weird about what happened. She said there had been houses in that area before the railroad tracks were built. That would have put it around the 1920s. Now, I've walked those railroad tracks since then thinking, well, maybe, but nothing like that has ever happened again. That's Jennifer from Idaho.
Yeah, disappearing houses are always interesting, and that there sounds like a time slip.
Oh, yeah. And we've had other ones. We had one where, and I've heard other stories like this, a young lady was playing with her friends in the woods, and they saw an older house that they never noticed before, but they thought they just never noticed it. And there was like a young boy with knee pants, probably from like the 1920s or 30s. It looked like looking at her. And then the mother comes out and pulls the child away. And she also looked like she was in kind of older clothing. Mm-hmm. And then, week or two later, they're like, oh, let's go check out that house, go take a closer look. And they went and they saw the foundation of a house.
Wow.
And we've had other stories like that. One woman, I believe it was in England, and this was a number of decades ago, but they had just opened a McDonald's, and it was a big deal. And she was getting a milkshake, and she was very excited, and she went to running towards the place. All of a sudden, she bumps into this man. But the man looks like he's from like the early 1900s. He has a top hat and a long black coat, and he kind of has a scowl. I'm kind of envisioning like Snively Whiplash or something with like the handlebar mustache. But he kind of like, how dare you, young person, run into me? I mean, I think these things happen. I think there's even a famous case. I've tried to track it down. I've heard people reference it in Liverpool, that people, within the last 10, 20 years looked, and then this number of people, and saw like a street from the 50s for a short time. I mean, these kind of things apparently do happen.
Yeah.
Not all the time, but they apparently do happen. I'm sure you've heard a lot about this.
Yeah, there's, in fact, when I went down to Alba Twitch Day, the show we did afterwards with Tim Renner, he was talking about how they walked through an area that he's fairly familiar with, and they saw a house, and he went, "That's odd, I've never noticed the house before," and they went back, and the house wasn't there.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I've also had at least, I think there were two different people who wrote in about this, where they had, well, I think there had been a few people who wrote in about disappearing roads, where they took a road, and then when they went to take it the next time, there was no road there. But I think there were two different people who experienced that in the same place, where they were like, I think I saw that road, and it's not there anymore.
Whoa. That's an odd feeling.
So that could be a time slip. It could also be some kind of dimensional displacement.
Yeah. And what if there are, the multiverse, there's slightly different worlds that are so much like ours.
Right.
And you kind of jump the track kind of.
So let's do this one. I mean, this is almost conspiracy minded, but let's do the strangest school day ever.
Yeah, this is one, and again, I don't doubt the storyteller, but if he's telling the truth, something remarkable happened. It may or may not be paranormal, but it is weird. It's one of those that there could be paranormal explanations, there could be alien abduction explanations, there could be experimentation explanations. This was actually from Ohio, my home state, Ray from Ohio. And he said this: "I don't know what this actually was or what it was all about, but it happened when I was in 5th grade. I lived in a small town near the panhandle of West Virginia on the Ohio River. I was on the Ohio side. Our elementary school was average. There were no signs of anything unusual in general. But there was this one day that was very strange. We got on the school bus as always, and the kids were talking on the way. We got to school, we went to our classes, but everyone seemed kind of subdued. I don't know how to describe it other than we seemed like we really weren't doing much in class. Basically, we seemed to be piddling around, kind of waiting for something to happen. Our principal came on the loudspeaker and said that we would be dismissing classes by the grades. We would be following our teachers outside, and then we would be told what to do. They started with the first and so on. They went room by room, and then went by grade. In the 5th grade, where I was, we waited for our turn to go outside. In retrospect, another strange thing was that any time our school was going to have outside events, such as fairs and stuff like that, the staff would tell parents, please don't dress your children in their school clothes. Have them dress appropriately for outdoor activities. But in this case, we hadn't gotten any note beforehand. That afternoon, I had on a pair of dress clothes, and I thought, man, I'm going to get my clothes all dirty, and then my mom will really be mad at me. This was the first indication that this whole thing was very abnormal. I remember my teacher sitting there waiting for the loudspeaker to fire up and dismiss our class. When word came, everybody stood up and we followed her out. We were all wondering what in the world was going on. Someone asked, where are we going? Our teacher said, you'll see when you get outside. We went down the stairs and into our cafeteria. Now, our cafeteria was one of those old school ones that doubled as a gymnasium. Tables were on the walls. You pull them out, and when you were done, you pick them up and slot them back into the wall. Then it was ready for any gym activities. The cafeteria was just a simple place, but at the time we went down there, the workers should have been preparing for lunch. It was strange because nobody was cooking in the cafeteria. The entire room was full of kids. They'd have each student walk up to a table, and they would ask you who you were, what class and grade you were in, and so forth. You'd move down the line, and they'd ask you different questions, such as where you lived. We cycled to the end of the room, and we were directed outside. Now, I can't remember precisely what the people running this were wearing. I almost want to say they were dressed in lab coats or were all in white. It was bizarrely bright outside. The sun normally would not shine like that. It was just intense. We went outside and our teachers left. And after we left that room, a person who was not from the school staff took us to a nice big field where kids would play football, practice cheerleading, or do whatever they're doing for the season. This person took us and started making us run laps, do rolls and flips, just do physical things. We did that for a little while. Then we went into a tent where they were testing us. They would say, can you put this puzzle together? Then you would put it together and they would say, okay, you did that one really well. Can you do this one and figure out that one? It was a really bizarre set of exercises. And I realized at that point they were testing us. Now, I wondered how it was going because I had been killing it on the physical stuff outside. I was beating everybody in the foot race. I thought, yeah, man, even in my dress clothes, I'm still running really great and doing my rolls. I saw a woman who I didn't recognize and I said, can you tell me how we're doing? The woman looked at me and she got this peculiar smile. She said, test? I said, what you're doing is testing us, right? You're seeing how good we can do this or that. She gave me a sideways glance and said, just wait here for a minute. Then another guy dressed in white came over and had me go with him. I went into another tent this time, but it wasn't an open one. It was closed like a circuit tent with the sides down. There was no exterior view. There were a couple of kids ahead of me. He said, just sit down. I sat down and he said, well, I'm going to draw some blood. We want to test a couple other things for me. I thought, that's really weird. I don't want to have my blood taken. But it was no big deal because I was the kind of kid who thought facing the dentist drill was cool. I also had no fear of needles. I said, take my blood if you need it. None of the kids were talking to each other. When we were outside doing the physical test, none of us were boasting that we could beat the others in a race. We were just focused on what we were told to do, and to me, that was an indicator that this was a really weird day. After we finished everything, the people in charge said, thank you. You're going back to your rooms now. We all went back in, and it struck me as odd that we didn't eat in the cafeteria, but outside instead. We never ate outside, regardless of the situation. Typically, we would have returned to the cafeteria, but it was non-functional that day. We all went back to our rooms and waited to be dismissed. And the weirdest part of the day was that nobody on the bus talked on the way home. It was dead silent. I got home and didn't say a word to my parents because I just figured we did what we were told, which was what we were expected to do anyway. The next day I went to school as always. Towards the end of the day, I remember looking at our teacher and I said, well, how'd we do in our test yesterday? And she looked at me in a weird way and said, what test did we do? I said, well, we went outside, ran, did the tests inside the tents, all of that. When do we find out how well we did? She said, we never went outside yesterday. I said, no, we did. We went outside and there were people in white. And she said, no, Ray, we were here all day yesterday. And everyone in the class was looking at me like I was imagining things. I said, no, we were here because I still have the needle mark in my arm where I have the blood drawn. I knew that I hadn't hallucinated the whole day, but nobody else remembered anything unusual. For weeks, I thought about it and wondered, where did that day go? Why did no one remember? Folks might speculate that this was an alien or governmental thing. I don't know what it was, but I remember it distinctly. I know it happened. I can't remember the people running it very well. I don't know what they looked like or what they were wearing, except I have a memory of something white like lab coats. And I have no idea who they were or why they were there. I want to say they were wearing sunglasses because it was so bright, but I can't tell you that's a fact. I remember everything else that we were doing. I remember the races and the puzzles that we had to put together. They were almost like Rubik's Cubes, the kind of stuff like that. And no one else remembered it. And that bothers me to this day. I know it wasn't a dream. You know how I know? I still have that needle mark on my arm from where they drew blood all those years ago. It's just one of those weird things I can't explain. And that's Ray from Ohio about the strangest school day ever.
You know what's additionally strange about Ray?
Yes.
He looks forward to the dentist drill.
Well, you know, actually, you bring up a point. Ray sounds from his description like a very smart young man. And
Yes.
was he singled out because he was exceptional?
Right.
And
Because if
physically and mentally.
yeah, I mean, it could be that whoever was conducting these tests was using some kind of hypnotic, maybe something in the air to put everyone in sort of a hypnotic state. And he broke out of it by asking questions that they didn't expect.
Exactly. That was my thought, whether it was a drug or something. He seemed to be immune to what was impacting everybody else, and maybe that's why they wanted the blood test.
Right. So that makes sense to some degree. I don't know exactly how he would add a hypnotic drug to an entire school. I mean, like I said, maybe in the air systems or something. I don't know. But it would have to be sort of a black project type of thing.
I mean, either it was governmental or some mass. I mean, there is that one, it was in Zimbabwe, the one case where the whole school
Ariel.
gave this account. Yeah, from the 90s, gave the account that the aliens showed up. Maybe these people in white were actually aliens of some type and they were mind controlling everybody. I mean, this is truly a case. And there are cases like this where there's two possibilities. I mean, I guess there's other ones, but the two main possibilities: a person's making it up,
Right.
which Ray did not seem like he was making it up, or something very, very strange, maybe paranormal. In this case, there's other explanations like government experimentation and things, but something truly bizarre happened.
Yes. Yeah.
And I mean, I'm a patriotic American, but our country has had a history of doing some pretty heinous things to people.
Oh, just a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of, and I don't mean just in history in general, I'm talking about experimentation on people.
Yep.
and things, particularly back in the day. So is it impossible? No. And so that's one that really just leaves you wondering, what the hell?
Yes. Yeah, that was a really weird one. Let's go with one of the other really weird ones. Let's go with one of your all-time favorites, the soft serve man.
Yes. Every time I think about that, I go, yeah.
Yeah, this was just disturbing.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is another one, very X-Files-y.
Yeah.
This was Dave from the Western United States. And I even contacted him because this was probably told on the show, like 2013, 2012. 13, 14, somewhere in there, a long time ago. But I contacted him not that long ago. I was wanting to do a video version. He's willing to do it, but he didn't want to, show his face. Because if you're in law enforcement, you've got to be careful. So we didn't end up doing it, but because it didn't make much sense to do a video if somebody can't show their face. But I totally understood. But he's still out there apparently doing his stuff. So this is Dave from the Western United States. All right. Dave said, I've been working in law enforcement for several years. I came from the eastern U.S. and moved to a relatively large department in the mountain states. At the time of this story, I was just working on the road on the graveyard shift. Typically graves, once it hits around 1 or 2 a.m., it's pretty dead, and that's how it was this particular night, that is until dispatch called. I was sitting in car to car with a buddy of mine from the department, and we got a call. Dispatch said that there was a guy jumping from an overpass onto semi-trucks. You get a lot of weird calls, and typically with something like that, you just think, well, that's just stupid. We got there, and of course, there's no one. We looked down off the overpass. It was about 60 feet to the ground. We were shining our lights, and there was nothing. There was a little cluster of bushes down below, and I shined my light on it, and immediately this naked man jumped out of the bushes. He looked at us. He outstretched his hand. He yelled at us with this weird growl. I could see that his hands were covered in blood almost to his elbows. He had blood dripping from his nose all the way down to his chin, and he was screaming. He started running towards the bottom of the on-ramp. We started running to catch him. My buddy got to him first. He's a much better runner than I am. And he grabbed the man's arm and started swinging him in a circle. Later, my buddy told me I didn't want to touch him. I didn't have any gloves on. I didn't want to start wrestling with this guy covered in blood, and he's completely naked to boot. Now, the naked guy was about 6'3" and a well-groomed looking man. The whole time he was growling at us, baring his teeth and biting repeatedly, just gnashing his teeth. My colleague swung him around enough, and the guy landed on the ground. I put my knee on his back to try to hold him there, plus I was holding his arm. My sergeant ran over and he yelled, "Watch out, watch out." He shined his light on the guy, and the man was just defecating all over himself. It sounds disgusting, but honestly, it looked like some soft serve ice cream was coming out of him. It's funny now, but it wasn't so funny at the time.
I'm sure.
This guy didn't even notice it. He had this really wild look in his eye, and he kept gnashing his teeth repeatedly. I kept trying to talk to the man, and there was no response. It took about 4 of us to get him in handcuffs. I turned over to look at him, and the whole time I was trying to examine him, he was twisting and trying to bite me. I never said a word. I gloved up and looked at his hands. He had no cuts on him. I thought that was weird, so I looked at his mouth. I had the others hold him so I could open his lips and everything, and there were no cuts in or around his mouth. He had no injuries, and I was trying to figure out where the blood came from. So I walked over to the bushes expecting to find a dead body or something, but there was nothing there. It was just weird. We were all pretty freaked out because it was such an odd experience. We just left the naked guy there in the ditch. This guy kept staring at us while moving his mouth up and down, gnashing his teeth. We called dispatch to tell them that we had one in custody. Our sergeant came over to do an arrest check. So far, Seriah, pretty weird story, right?
Yeah.
Well, it gets weirder. A highway patrol car pulled up with two guys in it. That was odd because they never ride two men to a vehicle. Each officer had his own car, but this one had two. We work closely with highway patrol in that area, and I know all the guys. There are only two or three in the area where this happened, and I'd never seen these particular officers before. And they were really rude, which was really weird too. I said, "Are you guys going to take this since it's on the highway?" They said, "Yep, we got it. We got it." They wouldn't talk to us after that. I thought, what a bunch of jerks. Then an ambulance rolled up, and they didn't even examine the wild man. They go to him, put him on a little stretcher, and throw him in the ambulance. I studied the ambulance so I could get its number for my report. Even though the highway patrol had taken over, I still had to do a supplemental report, and there was no ambulance number. I thought, that's weird. They drove off real quickly. What was even stranger about the whole thing is that I knew all the ambulance guys in the area because they go to our calls if someone's injured, and I'd never seen these guys either. Afterwards, I was writing my report. I called dispatch and said, "Hey, I need you to give me the names of those two highway guys." The dispatcher said, "Okay, I'll call." She called highway patrol, rang me back and said, "Highway says they never dispatched anyone. No one ever showed up." I said, "That's weird. Call the ambulance company and tell them I need their ambulance number." She called, got back to me and said, "They don't have any record of their ambulances showing up at all." I was wondering what the heck. I phoned all the local hospitals and none had any record of anyone showing up with similar injuries or being taken in by the highway patrol in this ambulance. So I have no idea what happened. I asked some of my highway patrol buddies about it, and they were freaked out, and they said, "We don't have anybody that matches the description of those two officers." I have no explanation. Overall, it was just a bizarre experience, and that's Dave from the Western United States.
Yeah, that one. I mean, again, that sounds like some kind of special project. Like they were experimenting on someone and they got out.
Yeah. What is that all about? I don't know. I mean, that one to me is more something like that than it is paranormal.
Right.
Unless
it was a werewolf.
Yeah, that's true. But then what is the ambulance all about in the kind of jerky highway patrol people?
Yeah. That's definitely a weird one. And kind of gross.
Yeah, the whole soft serve thing, I couldn't resist calling it that. I mean, it's just such a evocative title. But I mean, and like you said, in retrospect, funny, but not so funny. And then part of me worries about this guy. What happened to this guy? You know?
Yeah. And I mean, maybe at some point he killed a small animal and that's where the blood came from.
I think, unless this got edited out, because we try not to edit out any facts, but I don't know if I can't recall if I mentioned the story, but he was afraid maybe they would find a dead body or something, maybe he killed somebody or something. Because, somebody's full of blood that came from somewhere.
Right. Let's go with, there's a few you use here that are kind of parodies of other things in a sense for the title. The Last Ride to Clarksville, obviously. Last Train to Clarksville reference. Yeah,
it was funny because he mentioned Clarksville and that was the first thing I thought about. Even though I was born at the end of that era, I love the music of the 60s, and that came to mind. So this is another one, kind of exactly what it was. Tom from Ohio. It seems like Ohio is a hotbed. We've got several Ohio stories in this book, and it's funny because even though I'm from Ohio, I don't feel like we get a disproportionate number of stories from Ohio, but they do seem to be really creepy. So Tom tells his story. It was the late 90s and early 2000s. I worked with a youth group and went to a huge Christian concert in Pennsylvania called Creation. It's a festival, camp out type of thing. We grossly underestimated the amount of food we needed and had to get restocked. The camp store was super expensive, so we decided to trek out to the next town, Clarksville, and hit the big big box discount store there. There were 4 of us, and we got into my friend's truck, and we turned out into the road and went past a sign that said Clarksville, 11 miles. Anyway, we were flying and doing about 85 miles per hour. My friend would not slow down. He wanted to get this done and get back to the concert. We're making good time, or so we thought. We noticed that we were the only car on this road. If you looked out the passenger side where I was sitting, it was rolling country with farmhouses. They were spaced out quite a bit. On the other side, there was nothing but woods. We kept talking, and I noticed that the songs were cycling through on a CD player. 15 minutes or so had passed, and we should have been in Clarksville, but we weren't. 3 or 4 more songs went by, and we were approaching 30 minutes. We all started getting nervous and slap happy. I asked if anyone saw a turnoff or anything. They didn't. We were all focused on the road at this point. There was nothing, just this countryside. It started feeling weird. The best thing I can compare it to is a cork in a champagne bottle. When you shake it, you feel the pressure. The cork wants to pop. The tension was ratcheting up. We kept going and the CD played itself out. That made it about 45 minutes. I looked at the clock and it hadn't moved a minute. The gas gauge hadn't dropped a millimeter. Now, we were really looking at the surroundings. It seemed generic, like a loop. The farmhouses kept coming in sequence and they were empty. There was no one outside. There were no animals, nothing. Everything was dead quiet and seemed to be deserted. By this time, fear had set in, and my buddies started turning on each other. They were yelling and getting upset with each other. 2 of us wanted to keep driving, and the other 2 wanted to turn into one of these farms to see if anyone could give us directions. I strongly felt that was a terrible idea. Trying to get help at one of those farms was like the plot of every horror movie that I had ever seen. I thought we'd be doomed if we exited that car. I argued to keep driving and stay on the road. We weren't running out of gas or time. Just keep going. Finally, we popped out to Clarksville, a little town with a big store. We drove on this road to Clarksville for about 75 minutes when we should have been in town by 10. When we got out of the truck, I swear, I was about ready to fall down and kiss the ground. The truck stank of fear. When you get a bunch of worried people together, it's palpable. Even had our lists, and we all did our thing independently. We went and got our stuff ourselves. We talked with different customers and workers at the store about the distance to this festival and whether there were any alternate routes to get there. The answer was the same for each. There's one road and it goes to the mountains. That was bizarre because we didn't see any mountains. The festival itself is in this valley. We saw farms on one side and woods on the other. No mountains, all flatland. What made it doubly weird is that this was a rural highway. There should have been heavy traffic because it's the only road going through the area. But there was no one, just us the whole time. We loaded up and sat in the truck for a while because none of us wanted to make the turn back into that road. If there ever was a good time for prayer, that was it. We prayed and made the turn onto the road, and we didn't see a single thing on the trip back that we saw coming into Clarksville. The mountainous road back was just as the store workers and customers described it, and nothing like the one we'd traveled into town. It only took us about 10 minutes to get back to the festival. Now, we talked a lot and tried to rationalize it. We tried to find a reasonable explanation. It would be natural to think we got lost, but the fact was there's only one road in and one road out, and that shot that theory down. It didn't feel right on the trip there anyhow. It was so dead. It was like we didn't belong there. I have no explanation other than maybe we went through some stale pocket of time like in Stephen King's The Langoliers. It was terrifying because I wondered, are we ever going to get out of this? This is out there, but so many people go missing around the world and never heard from again. What if they stumbled into something like we did? What if, unlike us, they decided to visit their version of a farmhouse and got stuck? It's a scary thought. The 4 of us didn't talk about it to others for the longest time because we were concerned we would be considered nuts. We're getting older now and no longer care what anyone thinks because we know what happened. That's Tom from Ohio.
So that almost feels more like a glitch in the Matrix type of story.
Yeah, or they got into if we're in a multiverse, they got in an alternate version and popped in and popped out.
Maybe repeatedly. Who knows?
Yeah.
Looping, because it sounds like that's what was happening. They kept seeing the same scenery out. That's why I was thinking more like glitch in the Matrix type of thing. Like it's just caught in a loop.
Yeah, it's absolutely one of those things where, again, these things that happen are stranger than we can fathom. And what the reality is, it's one of those things like you wonder if someday if we find out the truth about this, maybe when we die, we're given this download of information. Yeah. And we go like, oh, that's what happened. Of course.
Or we get to see all the alternate us's in other universes.
Yeah. Yeah. And then what's the one theory that every possible permutation exists?
Right.
So, we're doing this podcast maybe in an alternate universe where you're sitting where I'm sitting where you're sitting, and you're on my show. I mean, It boggles the mind. It really does.
It boggles the mind because infinity boggles the mind, and we think, well, no, it can't be infinite. But then you look at just what we can capture with our good telescopes, and you see what look like a field of stars, and you're like, oh no, those are galaxies.
Yeah,
and you try to comprehend just how much stuff you're looking at in one picture.
Yeah. And I mean, the stuff that's coming out of the James Webb Space Telescope is blowing people's minds.
Yeah.
So, and that's still, again, a small sliver of what's out there.
Exactly. Let's go with Haunted Hike.
Haunted Hike. Yeah, this is one that, it reminds me a little of a Twilight Zone episode, a little bit of a Twilight Zone, and I love those.
There's a little Fey-led bit to this, too.
Yeah, that too.
And someone who could have become a missing person.
Yeah. Megan from California says, right before the holidays, I was listening to the Campfire podcast. A gentleman told me a paranormal story about the Trail of 10 Falls in Salem, Oregon, where I had also heard of a supernatural experience, I should say. I was amazed when I heard the story on Campfire. The trail must be a hotspot of sorts. My story happened in 2011, shortly after my father had passed away. I'd been spending a lot of time soul searching and going on solo hikes. The Trail of 10 Falls is a beautiful hike. One half is very heavily traveled. You'll see lots of families. The other half of it gets desolate. You could be hiking for quite a while and not see anyone. On this specific hike, I started on the less traveled end, a loop. I began to approach the more populated area where they have one of the most magnificent falls. It's one of the highest in the northwest U.S., and it looks like something out of The Lord of the Rings emerging from the middle of the forest. It's breathtaking. You can hike to it, but there's also a nearby parking lot and has wheelchair-accessible viewpoints so visitors can experience the falls without walking for 5 miles. This day, I was coming up to that spot and started to feel something in the air, something a little different. Many times when I experience paranormal activity, I smell oranges. Sure enough, I started to smell them. I looked across the bridge which crosses the waterfall, and there sat an elderly man on the bridge which crosses the waterfall, and sat an elderly man on the bench. So she looked across the bridge which crosses the waterfall, and there sat an elderly man on the bench. There, got a little tongue-tied for a moment. When I tell this story, people often ask, do you think it was your dad? He was not. He did not look like my father. The elderly man was older than my father when he passed. This man looked like he was in his 70s or 80s, and he was dressed in clothing that I think someone his age would have worn hiking. He had a big wooden walking stick. There definitely was a quality about him that I felt attracted to. I looked at him, and I thought we were making eye contact, but it was too far away to know for sure. I felt this powerful urge to reach him and talk with him. There was a connection there. I started hiking pretty fast, and when I passed under the grotto of the waterfall and came out, the man was gone. I was disappointed. That warm and comforting feeling was still in the air. I looked up a cliff, and I saw him again. This time he gave a little way. It was remarkable because there was no way he should have been able to make it that far that quickly. With the distance we are talking, there was no way even an Olympic athlete could have made it in that short time. I was in fantastic shape then because I'd been doing a lot of hiking. As a test, I tried to replicate his path. It took me 10 times as long as it did for him, and that was with me really sprinting. There is no way he could have physically done that. Regardless, I still sensed this warm, happy feeling. I felt it was all connected. I continued the loop toward my car, where the trail became desolate again. I came to a fork in the path I didn't remember. And while I didn't panic, I was confused. I stopped and thought, I don't remember there being a turn here. I was about to take my pack off to investigate further, and suddenly the old man was right before me. I hadn't heard any leaves rustling, breathing, or branches snapping. None of the things you listen for while walking in the woods. I never wear headphones when hiking, so I can be very aware of my surroundings. And at this point, the man was about 3 arms length from me. I could see he was a sepia color, not full color, not black and white either, but kind of a little bit translucent. He pointed down one of the paths and said, "Your car is that way." I turned to look, and then he was gone. Again, he made no sound whatsoever. He was gone within that split second. I turned to look down the path, and I am sure he was a benevolent guide for hikers in the forest. It was definitely comforting. When the old man pointed that way, I felt 100% certain that was the right path, and it wasn't a trap or anything like that. There was just no fear. Of course, the direction he pointed in led me right back to my car. That was Megan from California.
And again, it has that sort of Fey-led sort of thing where she's coming up to an intersection she doesn't ever remember seeing before.
Yeah.
And he points her in the correct direction. If she had taken the wrong path, maybe she would be a missing person.
Absolutely. Maybe that was maybe our father, maybe another ancestor. Maybe it was, as you suggested, some kind of forest guide. It's an interesting one, though. It's an interesting.
Yeah. We got to take a quick break. We will be right back. Quick mid-show break here and a recommendation. First of all, if you want to contact the show, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. And it's that simple. All the contact info is there. If you have a story you want to share with us, email stories@wheredidtheroadgo.com. All our social media links can be found there, as well as every show all the way back to the very first one in 2013. If you like heavy music, check out my music show, The Last Exit for the Lost, and that can be found at thelastexit.org. As far as a recommendation, I'm going to go with one that's not that obscure at this point because it's pretty popular. It's a show called From on the MGM network, and it gets compared a lot to Lost. And honestly, until just recently, I didn't really get that comparison so much because From is very paranormal. Right at the heart of it is just plain out, flat out paranormal. It feels to me like something Stephen King would have written. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it kind of depends where they're going with it. And as of this season, which I think was the third season I just finished, I have a pretty good idea where they're going with it, and I like it. I like what they're doing here. And so, yeah, we'll see how it ends. Lost didn't have a ton. It had Fortiana things in it, like the polar bear and stuff like that, but it wasn't out and out paranormal most of the time. I mean, eventually you got things like the smoke monster and things, but for the most part, it stayed away from overtly paranormal stuff, whereas From just completely embraces it. That being said, I do see the comparisons as on Lost, they were stuck on an island they couldn't leave, and in From, it's a bunch of people stuck in a town they can't leave where monsters come out at night. And it's good. It's a very good show, and one of the people who played on Lost is one of the main characters too. So that's interesting in and to itself, I guess. But yeah, I definitely recommend checking it out if you haven't. Of course, it ends season 3 on a cliffhanger, and who knows when season 4 is going to come about, but it is renewed. So there's that. Hopefully they'll be able to actually end it. I know a lot of people were mixed on the end of Lost. I liked it. It reminded me a lot of like Jane Roberts material, the Seth material. And so the ending really kind of fit with me that way. And honestly, a lot of the problems with Lost were not their fault. They had, I think, 5 seasons planned, and the TV company wanted more because it was so popular, so they had to add to the story when they already had a beginning, middle, and end. So that kind of mucked things up a little bit, and then you had a writer's strike in the middle of it, so it was a mess. But anyway, yes, my recommendation is From, if you haven't checked it out and you like kind of horror, paranormal type of stuff. And as I said, to me, it kind of feels like something Stephen King would have written. So take that as you will. All right, back to the show. So you're listening to Where Did the Road Go? And I'm talking with Mr. Jim Harold. And we're discussing his latest book, which is entitled...
Well, it's entitled True Ghost Stories, Jim Harold's Campfire, Volume 6.
And do you have anything else out aside from the Campfire Stories?
No, I've, my wife keeps saying, you need to write a real book. And I may do that at some point. I don't really know when I have the time, but we have 6 of the Campfire books out. Maybe some kind of like survey of favorite topics. Because, Campfire is just part of what I've done. I've done thousands of interviews of people that do work on UFOs, ghosts, metaphysics, and maybe some impressions that I've gotten over the years. I should really do that. It's just, it's the same old conundrum, time.
Yes, yeah. We need double the time we have.
Yes.
And double the energy.
Yeah, I'm hanging in. I'm in my 50s. I'm hanging in pretty well, but I'm like, and I still have, I work long days and this is my full-time job. So I was in here this morning, like at 8 a.m. Working. So it is, I still have a lot of energy. I'm just like, how long can I keep this up?
Yeah. I will literally work myself to burnout very regularly. But anyway.
Well, when you love what you do.
Yeah, exactly. I absolutely love it, but my brain will just be like, no, we're done for now.
Yeah. Sometimes you got to switch it up.
So let's talk about, which story was this? The Spectre and the Stairwell.
Yes, this was Ben from Oregon. And again, that's the thing that I love. One of the things I love about doing the Campfire podcast every week is, you get people from all over the world. And now we're like in a cycle where I'm getting a ton of stories from Canada for some reason. And we'll get, I've had the UK, many stories from the UK over the years, Australia, many stories. It's just a real pleasure to talk to people all over the country and actually all over the world and hear these stories. But to the Spectre and the Stairwell. And this was Ben from Oregon. Ben says, this was back in the late 90s. I worked third shift room service at a historical hotel in Wisconsin. This particular night was very, no pun intended, dead. We had only 3% occupancy. Now, when I worked in room service, I'd do hall sweeps. That's going up and down the halls of the hotel, collecting menus, dirty dishes, or whatever I'd find that needed tidying up. It was around 3:30 a.m. and the place was very quiet. I had to stay awake, so I decided to do another of those hall sweeps to keep my mind and body going. I was ending this latest sweep, and I always made sure I finished them on the third floor. At the time, I smoked, and there was an employee stairwell at the end of the third floor that went down to the basement, and from there you could quickly exit to the outside and smoke. I just finished the sweep, so I pushed the door open to exit the stairwell. It had one of those fire doors with a big bar on it that made a big clink sound. So I pushed it, and as soon as the door closed behind me, instantly the environment changed. I had the feeling you get when you're going up in an elevator. The pressure changed. My ears felt like they were going to pop, and everything was just very quiet. It was a very eerie feeling, very different. The atmosphere changed. I'm going down the stairs doing my thing. I got to the second level and I heard a noise like a fabric sound that sounds like corduroy pants. You'll know what I'm talking about if you've ever heard it. It wasn't specifically corduroy pants, but I heard some sort of fabric rubbing sound. I thought I was getting sick. Then I tried to talk myself out of it. I thought, oh, it's nothing. It's just my mind. I'm going nuts and getting sick, and it must be the heater or something. So I continued down. I got to the first floor, and right as I was about to enter my basement area, I heard the third floor door above me, and it was a big boom, boom sound that couldn't be missed. I stopped, turned around, and looked up, and I'm standing there, and I heard that noise again, that fabric noise. I heard mumbling, like people talking. I thought, oh, okay, cool. It's maintenance, it's security, they're talking, whatever. I was about to turn around and continue to the basement when I heard a huge gasp. It wasn't a scream, but I heard it from the top floor and it was almost in the basement. Then I heard boom, 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 boom. It sounded like running. I turned around and started back up the stairs, and as soon as I came around the corner, I saw Jill, one of the housekeepers who worked the third shift. Her face had the most terrifying look of trepidation I've ever seen on a human being. She looked like she was going to pass out. She was hyperventilating and pale. I said, Jill, are you okay? Oh, come on, sit down. Are you okay? She wouldn't talk. Her hands were shaking severely, and so were her knees. I had to grab her and bring her downstairs. We went outside to get some fresh air, but it was too cold, and we had to come back inside. I said, do you want me to call security? Jill said. No, don't call security. I said, Jill, I got to call security. You're going to pass out. I really thought she was. I asked her what happened, and she finally calmed down. She looked at me and said, well, I saw you on the third floor doing your hall sweep, and you were just getting towards the end, and I saw you go through the door, and I was going to run up there and scare you while you were going down the stairs, right? So Jill waited about 10 seconds. She opened the same door I entered, felt the same weird feeling that I did. She explained the same dizziness and haziness I experienced. While she was going down the stairway, she said there was a figure of a lady, and she had a black dress on with a veil over her. The woman in black is looking down. Now the stairwell is wide. Jill was going down, and this mystery lady was going up, and Jill asked her, can I help you? There was no response. And as soon as they were to pass each other, the lady stopped right where Jill was. Jill told me, Ben, I was about 1.5 feet away from her. I was about as far away from her as I am to you right now. I said again, can I help you? The lady looked up, and she had no face. It was like white. Jill said it was shimmering, like looking underwater at somebody's face. She said the woman's eyes were just as disturbing. They were as black as night. At first, the woman didn't look at Jill, but then she did. Jill told me, Ben, it focused on me, and it looked like she saw my soul. Those were Jill's exact words. I still think about it. My buddies always want to hear the story, and there are a couple of side notes. Jill turned in her time card that night. She quit and never returned again. I saw her several years later and we talked about it. Jill said she never told anybody about what happened except for her grandmother. She told Jill she'd seen a specific type of entity and that she should never discuss it again. Otherwise, the entity might come back. Ben says, I wonder if there's a reason why I didn't see it. Is Jill more open? Are some people open to seeing things and other more open to hearing them like I did? I told my wife that I wish I had seen it. She said, why would you want to see it? I would never want to see a faceless woman again. That's Ben from Oregon. Spooky story.
Yeah, and one of the things, well, first of all, I wanted to include more of a traditional ghost story, which this was.
Right.
But also, he describes that sound of fabric, like corduroy
Yeah.
pants, but not. And I have heard that, and it is, I think this is the first time I've ever heard anyone else describe it. It will happen to me. It hasn't happened in a while, but I would go to sleep, and I'd lay down to go to sleep, and then as soon as the lights were off, I would hear what sounded like fabric moving. And it was very distinct, and there's nothing else I can think of that would make that type of a sound. It was like fabric rubbing against fabric. And there's nothing moving in the room. There's nothing else that should be making noise in the room. And sometimes it would happen, it would keep happening, and I would just ignore it and go to sleep. Sometimes I'd turn on the light to make sure there's not something I'm forgetting about or a mouse or something. But I've never been able to figure out what it is.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that I find in the campfire is that we'll have something, that's unusual or something. And then later we'll hear, oh, I loved when I heard that story because that one aspect of the story, I never thought that happened to anybody else, but it really resonated with me.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's look at, let's go with the other one that you did a play on from Monty Python. He's a lumberjack, and that's okay.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
I think I got all of your references on this one.
Yes. Well, as I'm getting older, I'm finding fewer and fewer people get them. But this one was curious because it was from the Cleveland area, and the original story, I don't think we disclosed it in the actual episode, but where this happened was within 5 minutes of where I lived for 20-something years. I don't live there anymore, but this is kind of weird synchronicity, even though the caller was from South Carolina at the time. He called Matt, but it's an interesting story. I'll go ahead and tell it. Matt says, this is a story that goes back to the mid-'70s. Although I live in South Carolina, both sides of my family are from Cleveland, and we would visit there during vacations. One time when my mom was visiting my grandparents in Ohio, she was reading a book in their wood-paneled den. It was a cozy room in the corner of the house where everybody liked to congregate. She was up late, and suddenly she had a strange feeling that someone might be standing. She looked up, and in the doorway was a hulking man. He was wearing work boots, dungarees, and a checked shirt. She never made out his facial features. What came into her mind was a lumberjack. Mom saw him for a fleeting moment, looked again, and he was gone. It startled her. But she said she wasn't afraid. She knew he wasn't malevolent. The following day, she approached my grandmother in the kitchen and said, I've got to tell you something. Something strange happened last night. And grandma says, oh, you've met the lumberjack then. She came at it very matter-of-factly in her charming sing-song Welsh accent. My grandmother said, oh yeah, I've seen him a lot. She had gotten used to him. She stated, I don't think he fancies your father much. Apparently, the lumberjack would like to mess with Grandpa by hiding things. They would turn up missing and wind up in the weirdest places. What really drove Grandpa nuts revolved around his prized Rolex. Honestly, he probably got it through his black market post-World War II German connections. Anyway, he loved this watch. It would go missing and he'd ask, where's my watch? It would wind up in a bowl of nuts in the freezer or some other unlikely place. Grandpa was old school. He grew up at 110th and Superior, a rough neighborhood in Cleveland. He was a no-nonsense guy. He would never admit to either seeing or believing in the lumberjack. Years later, my mom told me about the lumberjack. Shortly after I graduated from college, I went to stay with my grandfather for about a week. My grandmother had passed by this point. Grandpa had me stay in Aunt Nancy's room. She wasn't living there at the time. I always had a weird feeling in the house, and I couldn't explain it. The house just felt eerie to me. For example, in the closet outside the den, my grandma kept a creepy baby doll with a missing eye. It frightened me and my cousins. We'd forget about it, open the door, and get the living daylight scared of us by this thing. Then we quickly closed the door so we didn't have to look at it. Also, there was a shed in the back of the property, and I was never once able to see inside it. Either I was too short or the windows were dusted over, but I never saw anybody open it or go into it. It just added to the weird vibe. The last night I ever stayed there, I was in my aunt's room. Lying in bed, I heard faint footsteps. Strangely, the footsteps weren't in the hall. They sounded further away and above me. They were getting louder and louder. It sounded like somebody walking up the roof's gable, crossing its ridge and coming back down toward me. It stopped right over my head. My mom said she wasn't frightened by the lumberjack, but I heard that night, well, it scared me. I knew I wasn't dreaming. I was too afraid to get up and wouldn't bother my grandfather. I just stayed there with the covers over me, waiting for daylight to appear. I didn't say anything about it to my grandpa. Before sharing this story with you, I talked with my Aunt Nancy because I knew she had an experience in this house. In her case, my aunt was living in the house again as an adult. It was very late at night and no one was around. She was watching TV or reading a book in the den and she looked up. Just like Mom, she saw a man wearing work pants and a checked shirt. She seemed to think he had a beard, but again, she had no concept of his face. He was standing in the doorway that faced out towards the backyard. There was also a doorway to a tiny bathroom nearby. Aunt Nancy looked again, and the lumberjack was gone. She got up to see if there was someone in the bathroom. There wasn't, and of course, there was no further sign of our friendly woodsman. A couple of weeks later, I called my mom. I said, I'm putting together this submission for the Campfire podcast. I talked to Aunt Nancy, and she said she just had the one encounter. My mom said, what? No way. She didn't tell you about the night it was she and I in her room? And I said, no. Apparently, Mom and Aunt Nancy were having a grown-up sleepover. My dad, sister, and I were visiting with some other relatives nearby, so we were away. It was a fun thing for them to harken back to their childhood years. Mom bunked with my aunt. They were all up all night chit-chatting. My mom was talking to my aunt, and suddenly she heard these light footsteps above her getting louder and louder. The steps crossed the roof ridge and stopped right over her bed. Mom said to my aunt, Nan, shh, did you hear that? Aunt Nan said, well, that's just the lumberjack. 3 generations have encountered the guy, and I do have a theory about him. There was an old apple orchard on the property when my grandparents bought it, and I wonder if a previous owner may have been an outdoorsy guy who planted the orchid, and he's the lumberjack. I decided to satisfy my curiosity the last time I was at my grandfather's house. I went to the mysterious shed to see if I could at least get a glimpse inside. I looked at the dusty window. There was nothing in the shed except for one thing, and it wasn't the lumberjack. It was that weird baby doll looking back at me with her single eye. Matt from South Carolina.
And as I told you before we started recording, it's very much the flannel man stuff that Tim Renner has been following.
Yeah.
Which started with his wife telling him a story about seeing basically what looked like a lumberjack one night in their house or whatever. And then listeners started piling in with flannel man stories.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's really interesting. It's one of those things where, you have the hat man, the flannel man,
yep,
shadow people. It's just, you wonder what this is all representing. And is it the same thing presenting itself in a different way? Who knows?
Yeah. And that's definitely a possibility. Let's go with, I don't know, there's first of all, every story in this book is interesting.
Well, thank you.
You have a great selection here, and there's 65 stories in this book. I think we've hit maybe 10. So maybe let's go with Peekaboo, I See You.
Peekaboo, I See You.
This is just a very creepy thing.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what to make of it.
And that's often the case. Peekaboo, I See You. This story is from Marissa from Florida. We moved into this house when I was about 5 years old. My parents had just divorced. It was a beautiful home. You would never think anything was wrong with it. My story started about a month or 2 after we arrived. My younger brother and I shared a room and slept in the same bed. He would be at one end and I'd be at the other. This one night I woke up in the early morning hours, which was unusual for me until then. I saw the bedroom closet open. This was the first of many nights where this kept happening, and each night the door would open a bit more every time. Eventually one evening there was something different. Along the open door, I saw a woman. I remember her hair being long, curly, and dark. She poked her face out of the closet. After that, I would wake up every night, and she would be there doing the same thing, terrifying me every time. At first, I thought it might be my sister, but she didn't have curly hair. I was searching for an answer, so I asked her anyway, and she said, "No, I don't know what you're talking about." Regardless, I still thought it might be her, but that theory was put to rest when my sister attended an overnight camp. The closet lady came out that night too. I was becoming increasingly frantic to find out who this mystery woman was. It kept happening. The lady's face would just keep poking out of the closet nightly. This went on for weeks, even months. I kept telling my mom, there's someone in my closet. There's a lady in my closet. My mom thought I was just a kid with an overactive imagination. Then my brother saw it. And that's when I couldn't handle it anymore. My brother and I were lying in bed, and I woke up as I did every other night, and I saw the lady. She was waving for me to come to the closet. I was terrified and told her, no, no, no. I started praying, and my brother kicked me and asked, Marissa, who is that? I said, Aaron, I don't know. So he scurried under me because he was terrified. The lady kept telling us, come, come. And she was waving at us the entire time. My brother screamed and my mom came running into the room. She turned on the light and the closet lady was gone. We both told mom what happened and she took it more seriously this time. She said, okay, come to bed with me. Our mom looked in the closet the following day and said, look, there's nothing in there, you guys. It's okay. You guys probably had a nightmare. She put a cross and Bible in our room on our nightstand. We went to bed that night and had the blankets pulled up to our necks. I woke up and the closet door was all the way open. We put a toy box against the door to protect us from the closet lady. It was pushed away and against the wall. Again, the lady appeared, but further out of the closet now. She said, come on, come, and beckoned us. I said, Aaron, are you awake? He responded, yeah. He was crying at this point. We had a picture of a cross on the wall next to the closet, which started rattling. This weird lady was waving at us to come to her. She did this over and over. We were screaming, no! My mom heard the commotion, came into the room, and said something went into the closet. She didn't know what it was, and she turned on the lights, and the picture of the cross fell. The closet lady didn't look old. She was young, about in her mid-30s. Sometimes I could see eyes, and sometimes I couldn't. Sometimes she would look more skeletal. Other times, she would look more full-faced. The first time I saw the movie Grudge, it terrified me. It reminded me so much of the closet lady that I ran out of the theater crying. To this day, I swear that if it's dark in my room, I can see her if the closet door is open. Closets freak me out, and the dark scares me. I have to sleep with the night lights on in my room, and I'm 25. Thanks, closet lady. Marissa from Florida.
I mean, we're assuming the closet lady was bad. I mean, maybe she was, inviting them off to an enchanted world somewhere.
Maybe. But I've got a little secret for you. Me and my wife rarely spend a night away from each other. Like when I used to travel for business a lot, we did. And, but tonight she had to go with my eldest daughter. My daughter is going on a college tour. She's looking to get into optometry and she's going to be, at a college. So they took a trip to go to this college and my wife's there to provide moral support and help drive and stuff. So tonight I'm at home with the dogs by myself, Seriah. So now I got to worry about the closet lady too.
I'm telling you, she might be nice.
I don't want to see her.
I think we have time for one more here.
We'll
do a couple on the Patreon. I don't know. Should we just go with Blood on the Walls? Because this one's pretty
Blood on the Walls.
Disturbing.
Okay. Yeah, some of these will really make you think. I'm really going to sleep well tonight, Seriah. Thanks.
Oh, you think about this all the time.
I do. Keeley from the United Kingdom. Blood on the Walls. My story started in 2000. We had just moved into our new to us Victorian house in a little town called Todmorden in West Yorkshire. My son Louis was very young at the time, and he said he saw strange things. He would wake up at the same time every night crying and kicking to get in bed with us. He wouldn't settle and was having general nightmares, which most kids do, so we didn't pay much attention. It got more concerning when one day he came downstairs and said he had a nightmare the night before that he'd seen his dad chopping my head off with a bread knife. My goodness. His dad and I were never, ever violent towards each other. In fact, we didn't even raise our voices to each other. I didn't let my son watch anything violent. I was one of those sorts of mums. Anyway, I just played it off as his imagination or something the kids at nursery had said. A few days later, we were in the kitchen and he came downstairs and I was making dinner. He starts looking up at the spot where he said in his dream that he'd seen his dad chopping my head off. I asked, what are you looking at? Louis said, Mom, why is blood running down the walls? I said, there isn't blood. Don't worry about it. I just ignored it. I was trying not to be scared, so I carried on making dinner. Then it progressed. Louis would come running downstairs asking, what did you shout at me for? What did you shout at me for? My son doesn't have a common name. at least where we live, so it wouldn't be somebody outside shouting for him to hear it. He would come down running downstairs. What do you want? What do you want? And I'd say nothing. And he'd say, oh, okay, and return to his room. Anyway, time passed. Incidents and little things happened, and I discovered I was expecting again. One day, Louie and I sat in the front room watching telly. The glass kitchen doors closed. It's a tulip design, so it's not entirely see-through, but you can tell if anyone's in the kitchen. The door was shut, but stuff was moving around the kitchen. Louie turned to me and said, see, Mummy, it's not me. I'm sat here with you. Not to scare him, I just went, it's okay. Let's just carry on watching telly whilst we're listening to things moving around in the kitchen. There couldn't and shouldn't have been anyone in this house. I thought it was bizarre, but I continued to play it down. I didn't want to scare Louie. Then he told me he saw a green mist hovering above him in his bed. Bearing in mind that he was almost 6 then, I was still thinking along the lines of imagination. I said, okay, don't worry about it. By this point, our second son had arrived and slept in the cot in our bedroom. I put the computer up there. My ex, the children's dad, worked as a chef, so he worked late into the night. Not enjoying being on his own downstairs, I would frequently sit and play on the computer upstairs in case my younger son needed me. Louie was in the attic directly above me. One night I was typing away, chatting to someone online, when right behind my head I heard, oi. So I looked around, thinking it might be the baby, but he was absolutely fast asleep. And I carried on chatting away, and then right behind me, I heard, oi! I jumped up, ran downstairs, poured myself a rather large glass of wine, and quickly realized I'd left the children upstairs. I played everything down, saying, don't worry about it, it's nothing. Of course, my ex never saw anything, so I wondered, why is this just happening to me and not him? Then I started hearing the sounds of children playing. It happened when both boys were up in the attic. My youngest was still in the cot. The eldest was in the top bunk of a bunk bed. We'd go to bed around 11 o'clock every night, and my ex would drop off to sleep straight away. I would be lying there, and I would hear children running backward and forward in the attic. I'd get out of bed and go upstairs, and literally, there would be total quiet as soon as I saw the top step. I'd check on the boys, and they were both fast asleep, and it was apparent they'd been that way for quite a while, so I went back downstairs. Again, the night after, it was the same thing. I heard thud, thud, thud over and over again. This time I thought, right, I'm going to catch you out. I very carefully and silently crawled up the stairs, all the time hearing these footsteps, till I got to the top step. And again, as I looked over the top step, there was complete silence. Both kids were fast asleep. After that, I didn't bother checking because I knew it wasn't my boys who were making the noise. Then my neighbor started knocking on my door complaining, your kids are running around at midnight. You need to make sure they're asleep. They're keeping me and my children awake, running backwards and forwards in the bedroom. And I said, it's not me. She insisted, yes, it is. We didn't massively argue over it, but I had to explain to her it wasn't us. It wasn't just the boys. They went to bed at a reasonable time. They were fast asleep, and both were excellent sleepers. I had no explanation to give her. Ultimately, I said, look, I think there's something else in this house. We're moving. I'll come back a week after I move, and let me know if you still hear the footsteps. I went back and knocked on her door a week later, and sure enough, she said, yep, still hear the footsteps. Nobody was staying in the house anymore. It was empty. The house was completely renovated, and a friend lives there now with her children. Her problem is that her children never sleep, and there is a slight twist to the story. I did some history checking on the house, and very close by there was a big cotton mill. The boiler blew in that mill and killed 200 people. The local morgue was full. It couldn't take all the bodies, and they laid them out on the streets right in front of this very same house. That's all I can put it down to. Maybe it had something to do with that, and that's Keeley from the United Kingdom.
I think you can tell it's from the UK because they call it a telly.
Yeah, and whilst.
Yeah.
Not a lot of Americans are saying whilst.
Yeah, that's a weird one. I don't know what the association would have been of the mill explosion, honestly.
Maybe she's thinking that it's ghosts or the spirits
of
those who died tragically. But, in the UK is an interesting thing. I've only been there once, but boy, the history. Yeah. You can feel it's one of these stories he talked about an emotion being almost palpable. And it's almost palpable. I remember walking into a pub that was, founded in the 1500s or the 1600s, and I was drinking a beer. And I'm thinking, somebody, a few hundred years ago was doing basically the same thing I am now, right here. That's crazy.
Well, we are out of time, but we'll do a few more on the Patreon segment. But where can people find you, your podcasts, and your books?
Well, I really would point them to the podcast first and foremost, the free podcast. Jim Harold's Campfire is where people come on and tell the stories in their own words. And then, of course, I have the Paranormal Podcast. And they can find the links to the books, the podcast, and everything at jimharold.com/links. jimharold.com/links. But for most people, if you enjoyed what you heard tonight, I would direct you to the podcast where you can get it everywhere. And, of course, the book, which is available on Amazon.
And the book, like I said, it's an excellent read. It's fun, and we only did a small fraction of the stories off of it. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in there.
Well, thank you, Seriah. Always great to visit with you. And I'll try not to make it eight years between the next book.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
I want to take a moment here to thank all of my Patreons. I can't do this without you. So thank you for supporting the show. And know that every positive thing that comes out of this show is partially because of you. I want to give a special shout out to all my patrons who are pledging $10 or more a month. Greg Ross, John Blackburn, Madeline J., Marty Garza, Matt in Delaware, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, Andrew Nichols, Matthew Sproul, Marthartha, Midnight Review Presents, Christine, a blue 2nd Gen MR2 drifting around a Japanese mountain, Patricia Gayaquinta, American Rambler, Andrew Maines, Ann Witowski, Barbara Fisher, Beverly Williamson, Billuminati, Bright Rectangle, Charles Davis, Charles in Florida, Land of the Crazy and Communicable, Corey Nelson, Craig Parmenter, Diane B., MTK, Eric Citron, Eric Todd, History and Coffee, J. Otto Bullitt, Jack Huntington, James Lindsay, Jim and Sophie, John Mattingly, John Bracken, Jonathan Frost, Carla Mahoney, Kevin Shurek, Cool Kitty, Kristen L., Laser Printer Jam, Lauren McLean, Linda from Michigan, Linz Jackson K., MJ Armstrong, Mark Shoemaker, Mark Brady, Paul Jeffries, Perry Peters, Philosopher of Mirrors, Riker and Stark, Ron Dupre, Sam Sharon, Sarah Horgan, Sasha McHale, Schmooples, Devourer of Mortal Souls, Stacy Sherwood, Stevie Norman, Strange Stories with the Seeker and Skeptic podcast, Tactical Therapist, Taylor Bell, Thunderboy, Tyler Glimstead, Varush K., Victoria, Vincent Trewell, Will Gebhard, Will Powell, Ren Collier, Annabelle Smith, Caroline Walker, TDT Skunkworks, Craig Sagastumi, and Matthew Brown. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. There is a short Patreon segment with Jim. He had limited time, but we got through a few more stories for Patreons. There's also an AMA show coming up that was all questions asked from patrons. That'll be the following week, and much more to come. I want to welcome a couple of new patrons, that being Croberts and Ari Sluter. I hope I said that right. Welcome, and I hope you enjoy the extra content and the shows a week early and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to become a patron, you can do so for just $3 a month. Just go to wheredidtheroadgo.com and click the Patreon link. And almost every week you get an extra segment, some extra bonus stuff here and there. You get the shows a week early, you get them commercial free. So yeah, go check that out. And it helps us, of course, keep this going, as do reviews and recommendations and things like that. So, review us, give us a high rating on whatever podcatcher you're listening to us on. Very much appreciate that. And I'll see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.